She uncrossed her legs for 3 seconds on screen, and it nearly ended her career before it started. Somewhere else, a studio built an entire star around the phrase, "show the curve every chance you get." And one woman's topless scene got condemned by the Vatican before American audiences even saw her face. For 100 years, Hollywood has reached for the same word to punish women who refuse to shrink themselves, vulgar. But look closer at these 20 stories, and the label starts to crumble. What critics called scandal, history now calls courage, and in a few cases, genius hiding in plain sight. We're starting with the scene that's still debated in film classes today, then working backward through a century of women who paid the price for being unforgettable. One interrogation room. One split-second movement. That's all it took to turn Sharon Stone from a working actress into a national controversy overnight. When Basic Instinct hit theaters in 1992, newspaper editorials didn't review the film, they put Stone on trial. A single leg cross during a police interrogation scene got labeled sleazy, gratuitous, vulgar, in headline after headline. Some theaters slapped adults-only warnings on the poster, even though the film already carried an R rating. Censors in multiple states debated trimming the shot down to nothing. Here's what got lost in the outrage. Stone was largely unknown before this role, and almost nobody asked her about the plot. They asked about morality instead. She pushed back hard, arguing that her character wasn't an object. She was the one in control of the room, flipping a dynamic Hollywood had used against women for decades. The label didn't care. It stuck anyway, following her into Sliver and Casino, films that kept the boundary-pushing conversation alive, whether she wanted it or not. What most people don't know is what came after the cameras stopped rolling. Stone survived a life-threatening brain hemorrhage and turned her recovery into public advocacy for brain injury awareness, a side of her story the tabloids never chased as hard as they chased that one scene. Decades later, interviews reveal a sharp, self-aware performer who understands exactly how one moment can define and distort an entire career. But Stone's scandal looks almost tame next to what happened when a pop icon brought handcuffs and candle wax to the big screen. By the time Madonna stepped into Body of Evidence in 1993, she'd already spent a decade rewriting the rules of controversy, and the MPA still weren't ready. The film landed an NC-17 rating, with regulators citing what they called vulgar sexual content. Newspapers didn't hold back, declaring that the reigning queen of pop had dragged Hollywood into the gutter. But this wasn't new territory for her. A year earlier, her coffee table book sex triggered bookstore boycotts in some cities, while simultaneously becoming one of the fastest-selling books of the year. That contradiction became her signature, outrage and success, arriving together every single time. What critics conveniently ignored were her quieter performances, Desperately Seeking Susan, A League of Their Own, roles that showed genuine range. Instead, headlines fixated only on the moments designed to provoke. Madonna never apologized. She defended her most explicit work as a deliberate exploration of power and desire, arguing that women deserve the same ownership over their own sexuality that male stars had claimed for generations without consequence. Watch those scenes today, next to what streams on television every night, and they barely register as shocking. That gap says less about Madonna and more about how fast the goalposts move. She became proof that vulgar isn't a fixed line. It's a label passed down generation to generation, waiting for the next woman bold enough to break it. Decades before her, another actress faced something far darker than outrage. Audiences didn't call her performance vulgar, they called it unwatchable. At the 2002 Cannes premiere of Irreversible, people didn't just criticize the film, they physically walked out. A brutal, unflinching sequence at the center of the movie left audiences calling it cruel, vulgar, nearly impossible to sit through. Monica Bellucci, who played the victim at the heart of that scene, didn't run from the backlash. She defended the film as a deliberately raw statement about violence, one meant to disturb, not titillate. The problem was that headlines rarely separate the two. A single harrowing sequence became the entire story, and the vulgar label attached itself to Bellucci's name almost overnight, overshadowing everything else she'd built. And she'd built plenty. Earlier work in Molina and The Matrix Reloaded had already established her as more than a striking face. She moved fluently between Italian, French, and English, and press junkets often caught her quoting philosophers between takes, defying every stereotype critics tried to pin on her. Time has been kinder than the initial reviews. Critics now revisit Irreversible as a serious, if uncomfortable, artistic statement, and Bellucci's willingness to confront that material head-on looks less like scandal and more like conviction. Her career raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. Is it really vulgarity when a film shows pain honestly? Or is the real discomfort in pretending pain doesn't exist at all? Long before Bellucci, though, a teen sitcom star found out just how fast an industry can turn on you in a single afternoon. When Showgirls premiered in 1995, the reviews didn't just criticize it, they went for the jugular. Critics called it trash, a vulgar carnival, career suicide caught on film. And overnight, Elizabeth Berkley, until then best known as the wholesome star of Saved by the Bell, became the face of everything people said was wrong with Hollywood excess. The backlash reached further than most people realize. Lawmakers referenced the film during debates about pornography ratings, even though its actual plot centered on ambition and betrayal in the world of Vegas entertainment, not the shock value critics fixated on. Berkley absorbed the fallout in real time, late-night talk show jokes at her expense, a noticeable chill from studios that had once courted her. But she never disowned the film. She spoke publicly about the necessity of creative risk, insisting that an actor who never risks failure never really pushes anywhere new. Time proved her right, just slowly. Showgirls has since been reclaimed as a cult classic, its over-the-top style now celebrated as camp rather than condemned as trash. Berkley rebuilt her career on Broadway and in cabaret, and became an advocate running self-esteem workshops for young performers. Looking back, the vulgar label attached to her says far more about the culture wars of the 1990s than it ever said about her. But if you think a single film can wreck a reputation fast, wait until you hear what one scene with melting ice did to Kim Basinger. Dim lighting, slow jazz. Kim Basinger licking melted ice cream off her fingers in 1980 SXS 9.5 weeks. That single image sparked debates that stretched from film critics to city council chambers. Basinger herself described the film as an emotional opera, a study of obsession and control. Critics weren't as generous, with some dismissing it outright as softcore dressed up as art. Some city councils actually weighed banning it. Church groups warned congregations to stay away. The word vulgar followed Basinger for years afterward. That backlash sat oddly against her earlier, more innocent roles, a contrast that seemed to confuse the same critics trying to define her. Then came an even bigger headline grabber. Basinger stunned Hollywood by purchasing an entire town in Georgia, intending to turn it into a film studio. The press mocked the move as tacky overreach, and financial trouble followed soon after. Most people expected that to be the end of her story. It wasn't. Basinger came back and won an Academy Award for L.A. Confidential, playing a call girl modeled loosely on 1940s screen icon Veronica Lake, but giving the role a wounded dignity the script alone didn't demand. That performance did something the tabloids never could. It proved her range ran far deeper than any single controversial scene. Now rewind further, back to an era when Hollywood was inventing the rules of scandal for the very first time, starting with a woman's studios literally sculpted to be too much. If MGM built Marilyn Monroe as champagne, 20th Century Fox brewed Jane Mansfield as something closer to soda, sweet, loud, and always on the verge of spilling over. She arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1950s already understanding publicity better than most agents on the studio payroll. At one packed dinner, her dress famously slipped at exactly the wrong, or right, moment, and flashbulbs went off before anyone could react. Newspapers, using the era's polite term for it, called her vulgar. In The Girl Can't Help It, she strutted past milk bottles that exploded with foam as she passed. Subtlety was never part of her strategy. Britain's censors briefly refused to allow her cabaret act, calling it indecent, and the Catholic Legion of Decency protested her films for featuring some of the first nude scenes by a major American star. Mansfield met every uproar with a smile, touring with a heart-shaped bathtub as a publicity prop and a chihuahua trotting beside her. What reporters rarely mentioned, she read classical philosophy in her downtime and spoke 5 languages fluently, constantly surprising journalists who expected nothing behind the image. Her dresses, measured by designers in inches of exposed skin rather than yards of fabric, kept the bad taste label glued to her name. A tragic car accident in 1967 cut her story short, but it also froze her image permanently, a wink, a spotlight, and a lesson that vulgar sometimes just meant having more fun than polite society could tolerate. Decades earlier, though, one platinum blonde bombshell made Jane Mansfield's scandals look almost quaint. Long before Marilyn Monroe's white dress became iconic, Jean Harlow's platinum hair was already blinding audiences in the 1930s. MGM bleached it until it shimmered like frost, then put her in silk slips for films like Red-Headed Woman and Dinner at 8. Harlow didn't play coy. She fired off slang that critics said belonged on a loading dock, not a movie screen, calling suitors suckers and bosses big boy. Newsweek dubbed her the girl who made sin shimmer. In Red-Headed Woman, her character marries her boss, slugs his wife, and seduces nearly everyone else on screen, including a scene where she locks a door and throws away the key. State censors clipped frames wherever they could. It didn't matter. Audiences lined up around the block anyway, proving Scandal sold tickets faster than it scared people off. When a columnist asked how she felt about being called vulgar, Harlow just laughed it off, joking that it was simply this decade's word for something people used to call her already. Off-screen, her night-clubbing in backless gowns fed gossip columns relentlessly, yet co-stars consistently described her as warm and well-mannered between takes. That contradiction fascinated the public, a screen bad girl with impeccable manners in real life. Harlow's sudden death at just 26 froze that image forever. Dangerously alluring, eternally young, and still discussed today for daring to look and sound improper in an era that demanded women stay quiet. But before Harlow ever set foot on a soundstage, one woman had already invented the entire playbook. In the early 1930s, actresses were expected to speak politely and dress modestly on screen. Full stop. Mae West looked at that expectation and simply ignored it. She wrote her own stage play, Diamond Lil, and carried that same defiant energy into her films, appearing in tight satin gowns, delivering lines in a slow, teasing drawl loaded with double meanings that audiences couldn't miss. Parent-teacher groups and church leaders warned that her jokes would corrupt public morals. Hollywood's newly formed production code actually cited her films as proof that the industry needed stricter rules. A Boston radio station went so far as to pull one of her comedy sketches off the air for sounding too suggestive. West's response: she leaned in harder. She joked openly that censorship made her rich, since every complaint about her work just drew bigger crowds to the box office. It was a strategy years ahead of its time: turn outrage into free advertising. That fearless approach became her signature, but also locked her permanently into the reputation as the era's most vulgar star, a label she wore less like a wound and more like a crown. Her influence outlived every attempt to silence her, but she wasn't even the first. Years before West wrote a single line of dialogue, a silent film star had already taught Hollywood that danger didn't need sound to be scandalous. Rewind to 1915. Movies had no sound yet, but the headlines still screamed. Theodosia Goodman, rebranded by studio publicists as Theda Bara, became the face of a manufactured scandal. Press agents even claimed her stage name was an anagram for Arab death, pure invention designed to sell mystery. In the silent hit A Fool There Was, she lounges in a deck chair, eyes rimmed in dark kohl, luring a married man toward ruin, with one title card warning simply: "Kiss me, my fool." Audiences had never seen a woman command a screen with that kind of open menace. Her promotional posters draped her in snakeskin and tiger pelts. Church bulletins called the imagery satanic. On set, by contrast, she was famously soft-spoken and professional, but Fox Studios staged photo shoots with occult props anyway, feeding the myth for publicity's sake. Some small-town theater owners refused to book her pictures altogether, fearing backlash from local parishes. It didn't matter. Trainloads of curious fans showed up regardless. Only a handful of Bara's films survive today, but her dark-eyed, deliberately wicked persona did something no one expected. It created an entirely new word. Vamp, shorthand for a woman considered dangerously free with her charm, entered the language because of her. By the early 1920s, flapper culture had cooled her act down, but every femme fatale who came after, in every decade since, borrowed something from that first slow, silent smile. Not every vulgar label came from a performance, though. Sometimes it came from a single kiss that censors couldn't legally justify cutting. Picture a Berlin cabaret wrapped in fog and a voice too low and too knowing for a woman of her era. That was Marlene Dietrich's introduction to the world, and she brought that same defiance straight into Hollywood. Tuxedos, top hats, and an open refusal to follow anyone's rules about femininity. In 1930s Morocco, she kisses another woman directly on the lips before tipping her hat to a room of stunned men, a moment several state censor boards tried to cut and simply couldn't justify removing. She followed it with a slinky white gown in Shanghai Express, delivering lines that implied entire nights of scandal without saying a single explicit word. Review boards called her immoral. Newspapers used vulgar as convenient shorthand for what they really meant. Her gender-bending wardrobe made people uncomfortable. Dietrich's response was characteristically dry. Clothes have no sex. Off camera, her dinner parties became legendary for mixing caviar with sausages, high culture with sailors drinking songs. She saw no reason those worlds needed separating. During World War II, wartime photos show her performing for Allied troops near the front lines, dressed in a suit once again, refusing to soften her image even in a war zone. Moralists never stopped calling her indecent. Soldiers freezing in foxholes called her something closer to courage. Dietrich outlasted the word vulgar entirely, turning every accusation thrown at her into art instead, proof that one perfectly timed grin could dismantle censorship faster than any protest. But not every actress who shocked Hollywood did it with glamour. One did it with a scientific mind nobody bothered to ask about. Years before Wi-Fi and Bluetooth existed, Hedy Lamarr had already shocked Europe. In 1933's Ecstasy, filmed before she ever reached Hollywood, a skinny dipping scene and an implied moment of private intimacy nearly got the film seized by U.S. customs officials as obscene. Vatican newspapers denounced it outright as vulgar art. When MGM finally introduced her to American audiences, studio chief Louis B. Mayer reportedly warned reporters not to expect a repeat. She'd come from a naughty European picture, but in Hollywood, he insisted, she will be a lady. Even so, her smoldering presence in Algiers and Samson and Delilah carried an unmistakable air of forbidden fascination that no studio warning could fully contain. At parties, word spread that Lamarr openly discussed love, science, and male ego in the same breath, subjects 1940s gossip columnists considered wildly unladylike for a woman to raise at all. What almost nobody reported at the time. During World War II, Lamarr co-invented a frequency-hopping communication technology, a real scientific breakthrough that today underpins Bluetooth and secure wireless signals. Reporters, given the choice, kept asking about her romances instead. Lamarr later delivered one of Hollywood's sharpest self-aware lines, "Any girl can be glamorous. All she has to do is stand still and look stupid." The irony is impossible to miss. She was never still and never stupid, and yet the early vulgar label never fully let go. Today her legacy finally balances what it should have all along, genius alongside glamour. Not every scandal came from a screen, though. Sometimes it came from a Senate hearing room. Dark bangs, a bright smile, and that unmistakable leopard print bikini. Betty Page was the picture of 1950s pin-up perfection. But her most notorious work wasn't glossy calendar photography. It was a series of low-budget short films featuring playful bondage-themed scenes, and in 1957, U.S. senators actually screened excerpts of that footage during an obscenity hearing. The press branded it vulgar filth corrupting American youth. Page's own account of the work was far less dramatic than the outrage suggested. She described simply answering a casting call and treating it like any other modeling job. Off camera, she volunteered at church and baked for her neighbors, a contrast that seemed to genuinely confuse the moral crusaders trying to define her as dangerous. After she stepped away from modeling, Page disappeared from public life for decades, eventually attending religious schools and privately facing mental health struggles that the public knew almost nothing about at the time. She was nearly forgotten entirely until a wave of nostalgia in the 1990s reintroduced her as a full-blown cult icon. Modern audiences tend to see empowerment in the same photos that once triggered Senate alarm bells. Page's story is maybe the clearest example of how much the word vulgar depends on who's looking, and when the same images that once justified government hearings now decorate coffee mugs and high-fashion runways. Sometimes, though, all it took to spark outrage was a single glove sliding slowly off one arm. Picture the slow rumba beat, a single satin glove sliding down an upraised arm. Rita Hayworth's dance number in 1940's XS Gilda is still Hollywood shorthand for pure, controlled seduction. At the time, though, the routine sparked real protests. Hayworth removes exactly one glove in the scene, nothing more, but critics still labeled it a striptease by suggestion and lobbied hard for cuts. Life magazine celebrated the number, while parent groups condemned it as vulgar eroticism, the same 3 minutes producing wildly opposite reactions. Wartime pin-up photos of Hayworth in black lace had already papered barracks walls around the world, and at least one military chaplain complained that the images were lowering troop morale by raising other things entirely. Off-screen, the woman behind the persona was actually born Margarita Cancino, shy, bookish, and known for practicing dance routines until her shoes wore through. Hayworth grew to resent the love goddess image the studio built around her, once remarking that men went to bed with her character Gilda, but woke up with her instead. Still, producer after producer built roles around that same slow hip sway, reinforcing the idea that her mere presence on screen was somehow indecent. Her later years, marked by difficult marriages and an early Alzheimer's diagnosis, softened public judgment considerably. But that single glove remains one of film history's clearest examples. It takes almost nothing for Hollywood to brand a woman vulgar. Long before gloves and gowns, one actress brought raw Brooklyn street energy to a genre that had never seen anything like it.